Ever feel like you're just, scratching the surface of really fascinating ideas?
Hmm.
You want to get to the core of things, understand the why behind it all, but honestly, the sheer amount of information out there, it can be overwhelming.
Totally. It's easy to get lost.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to tackle today. We're taking a pretty complex subject and extracting the most insightful bits for you.
Yeah, making it digestible so you feel well informed, but without the headache.
Exactly.
And our guide for this deep dive is John Leonard Asenden. He's a Norwegian scholar. Well, more of a private scholar, really.
Right. He spent, what, 3 decades studying religion?
Yeah, 3 decades. And what's interesting is it's not for academic stripes or anything. It's purely driven by his own passion, his own need to understand.
And his focus is pretty unique, isn't it? He's looking for.
He's looking for what he believes is a kind of hidden universal doctrine, something embedded within the Bible, but also in other ancient traditions.
Okay, so connections we might not normally make, like Christianity and
Uh-huh.
Hinduism.
Hinduism, yeah.
Hmm.
Ancient Egyptian religions, the Greek mystery schools. He sees them as pieces of a larger interconnected puzzle.
Hmm. So our mission today then is to explore his perspective on this lost esoteric understanding with religion.
Especially within Christianity, yeah. And we're drawing from his analysis of sources like the early church fathers, people writing way back when.
Got it. And his main point is.
His central argument is that true religion, like the real purpose of it, isn't just about faith or following rules. It's about a radical transformation.
Transformation of consciousness.
Exactly. A journey, you could say, from suffering and, well, ignorance towards wisdom and compassion.
And figures like Jesus, how do they fit in?
He sees them not just as historical figures, but as examples. Examples of the potential end result of that spiritual evolution.
Okay, transformation of consciousness. That sounds like a huge idea. What does that actually look like, according to him?
Well, he points to Scripture, like Ephesians 4:13. It talks about attaining the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ.
Right.
So for Ascendon, that suggests this ultimate goal. He sees figures like Jesus as having achieved, mastery over negative emotions, having a really sharp intellect, deep empathy.
And you mentioned abilities beyond the ordinary.
Yeah, that's part of it too. Things that might seem, well, supernatural to us now.
Intriguing. How does that connect?
He links this to the idea of encountering divine forces. Not just praying to something out there, but experiencing it within yourself.
Within.
Yeah, the very energies that, underpin the universe. He finds parallels everywhere. The Holy Spirit in Christianity, Shaktipat in Hinduism and Buddhism. It's this idea of a direct transmission of spiritual energy, something that kickstarts that transformation. So it's not just believing, it's experiencing.
So it's more than just intellectual understanding. It's a fundamental shift in how you actually experience reality.
Precisely. And Ascendant is careful to stress the goal isn't to create someone, extreme or fanatical.
Right, not a zealot.
No, but a balanced, wise individual. This transformation, he believes, involves he calls it psychosomatic rewiring.
Psychosomatic rewiring, like physically changing.
Well, think of it as a deep internal adjustment, mind and body. And it requires specific steps, a specific process.
Okay.
But he also warns about the dangers here. If you misinterpret this stuff, if you take symbols literally without grasping the deeper meaning.
That's where things go wrong.
Yeah, that's how you can end up with, rigid, cult-like behavior, exclusionary thinking. It stems from misunderstanding.
And finding someone who genuinely gets this, a real teacher, that's got to be tough.
Oh, absolutely. Ascendon really emphasizes how rare authentic teachers and lineage holders are. He talks about his own decades-long search.
Right.
Now, to really understand why this transformative insight seems, hidden or lost, especially in Western Christianity, we need to talk about something called Disciplina Arcani.
Disciplina Arcani. Okay, sounds cool.
It kind of was. It means basically the discipline of the secret. It refers to that ancient practice of concealing deeper religious knowledge.
From who?
From the uninitiated. From those who hadn't gone through the proper steps or weren't deemed ready. Think of it like keeping the advanced course material locked away until you've passed the intro class.
Okay.
Ascendon argues that the understanding of this whole transformative process got lost pretty early on in Western Christianity because this practice fell apart.
Interesting. So how does that relate to, say, the Gospels?
Well, he suggests the Gospels themselves, the bedrock of Christian belief, might actually be these esoteric texts.
Wait, the Gospels. Not just straightforward history or teachings.
That's his argument. He calls them cult documents or mysteries. The Greek word is mysterion, a hidden thing, a religious secret.
So the idea wasn't originally for everyone to just pick up the Bible and read it literally.
That's his perspective. And he backs it up by pointing out, look, for centuries, the Bible wasn't widely available anyway. It was mainly in Latin, held by the clergy, the elites, and even within those groups, he suggests, only a select few were likely initiated into these deeper esoteric meanings. He even cites Origen, an early church father, who straight up said that having public teachings and hidden teachings was common back then in both religion and philosophy.
So like two levels, a public story and then the real story inside.
Exactly. Think about the ancient mystery cults. They had public myths, rituals everyone could see, but then they had a secret oral tradition, the Disciplina Arcani.
Taught only to initiates.
Right, after they'd taken an oath, gone through rites. Baptism, in the Christian context, might have originally been part of that kind of initiation.
And they took this secrecy seriously.
Deadly seriously.
Ah.
And places like Greece, Rome, Egypt, revealing the secrets could literally get you killed. People talk about Plato spending years studying Egyptian mystery schools.
Wow, that's intense commitment.
And Assen's point is, this secret doctrine wasn't just in one place. He thinks it was universal.
Universal, across different religions.
Yeah. If you were truly initiated into the secrets of one, you can basically understand the core principles of the others. He believes the written texts, like the Gospels, were designed almost like workbooks, tools for these transformative practices.
Okay, but then why did Christianity become so dominant if other mystery cults had similar secrets?
That's a great question. Assendin suggests Christianity's initial inclusivity was key.
Inclusivity.
Yeah, it welcomed everyone, rich, poor, slaves, women, offering this path to transformation regardless of social status. That was pretty radical.
Which probably didn't sit well with the Roman authorities.
Exactly. That likely fueled some of the conflict. And he points out the irony later, when the Pope eventually takes the title Pontifex Maximus, a title held by the Roman emperors.
A shift away from those beginnings.
Perhaps. Now, this lost secret doctrine, why don't most modern Christians recognize it, if it's supposedly in the Gospels?
Yeah, good question.
Assendin's answer is basically a lack of comparative knowledge. Most people today don't study ancient sciences like sacred anatomy.
Sacred anatomy, what's that?
It's understanding the human body not just biologically, but as a spiritual vessel, a map of consciousness. And also Mantriana, the science of using sacred sounds or chants for transformation.
Okay. Give me an example.
All right, think about salt in the Bible. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth.
Right, usually interpreted as meaning like preserving goodness or adding flavor.
Exactly. But Assendin says, in the ancient mystery traditions, salt was a specific symbol. It represented wisdom, yes, but also a particular internal psychosomatic process.
And an internal process.
Yeah. And there was even a practice called the donatio salis, the giving of salt in some pre-baptismal rites. But the deeper meaning, the how and why, that wasn't explained to everyone.
It's like reading encrypted messages without the key.
Precisely. He calls it security through obscurity. The deeper layers would only really click for those who already had some foundational understanding, some capacity to see it.
So myth wasn't just stories, it was encoded knowledge.
Right. It required effort, an open mind to unpack.
No.
But that's also the danger, isn't it? If you lose the key, you're just left with the surface story.
And you start taking it literally.
Which is what Assendin thinks happened.
Yeah.
He's clear. He thinks many modern pastors have good intentions. They're sincere. But the dominant literal interpretation took hold centuries ago.
When did that happen?
He points to the period after the Disciplina Arcani,
Yeah.
that practice of secrecy, was basically made illegal by the Roman state. That was around the 4th century.
Ah, so state control influenced religious interpretation.
Seems likely. And what happened to the people who held that secret knowledge? Well, the later Catholic Church had its explanations for why the Disciplina Arcani faded away.
But Assendin has a different take.
He suggests a more sinister possibility, involving active persecution of the original lineage holders, especially those centered in Egypt.
Egypt seems to come up a lot.
It does. And we have to remember, early Christianity wasn't monolithic. It was incredibly diverse. There were many different Christianities, you could say.
Including Gnosticism?
Exactly. Gnosticism, which emphasized gnosis or direct personal knowledge of the divine, was a huge influence.
So even within early Christianity, there wasn't just one understanding of this secret stuff.
Assendin proposes maybe 4 broad levels.
Yeah.
First, you've got the average believer.
Yeah.
probably unaware of any deep secrets, focused on the basics.
Okay.
Second, the lower clergy. Maybe knew a bit more, but likely focused on the public rituals, the exoteric side.
Makes sense.
Third, you have the bishops, the church leaders, the doctors of theology. And even among them, there was an agreement. Some thought the Trinity was the big secret. Others thought it was the Eucharist, communion.
So disagreements even at the top.
Right, but then there's a fourth group. This is the really interesting one. He calls them the elect, or the perfecti, a kind of inner circle.
It's the perfected ones.
Yeah, and maybe a silent network of certain bishops, people like Cyril of Jerusalem, who seemed to know the deeper doctrine, but deliberately kept it secret. Cyril actually told his initiates not to write it down, but to inscribe it upon your hearts.
Wow, that sounds very Gnostic. Those that know.
Essendon definitely draws a connection there, particularly to a form of Gnosticism from Alexandria that seemed aligned with some of St. Paul's ideas.
But it's not exactly Gnosticism as we usually think of it.
He's careful to clarify that. He believes the doctrine he's uncovering is actually older than known Gnosticism, though related. Now, this brings us to how the version of Christianity we mostly know today got solidified.
Constantine and Eusebius.
Yeah, Eusebius of Caesarea, working under Emperor Constantine.
Hmm.
He played a massive role in compiling the canon, deciding which Gospels were in and which were out.
And apparently some got burned.
Reports suggest that, yes, Gospels that didn't fit the preferred narrative. And here's a twist. Eusebius was connected to Origen.
The guy we mentioned earlier, who believed in esoteric teachings.
The very same. Origen believed in reincarnation, initiation, secret doctrines, and he even saw value in pagan philosophy as a kind of preparation for Christian understanding.
But Eusebius ended up promoting a different version.
It seems so. And Essendon suspects one of the key points of, let's say, alteration or emphasis was the very nature of Jesus.
How so?
He suggests that earlier views might have seen Jesus more as a human who underwent this intense process of purification and transformation.
To become the Christ.
Exactly, aligning with this idea of being Christed
Right.
as a potential path, an achievable state for others too. Even St. Augustine acknowledged that Christ was a title, not just a name.
But that's not the dominant view that came down to us.
No. And Origen, who held some of these less orthodox views, was eventually declared a heretic, excommunicated centuries after his death.
History is written by the victors, as they say.
It often seems that way. Now, to get another angle on this human becoming divine idea, Essendon looks east.
To India.
To the yogic traditions, yes. Think about gurus in India. They are often venerated almost as embodiments of the divine.
Right.
The idea is that through intense practice, they attain spiritual powers, their ego becomes transparent, and there's this understanding that God, guru, and self are one.
A different model than the Western one.
Very different. Essendon proposes that if we view Jesus through that kind of lens as a human who achieved radical transformation, it could actually resolve a lot of historical puzzles and theological knots.
And connect with other ancient traditions.
Precisely. It aligns much better with Eastern esoteric doctrines and the core ideas of the ancient mystery schools. He points out that even Justin Martyr, an early Christian writer, acknowledged similarities between Christian beliefs about Jesus and pagan beliefs about figures like the sons of Jupiter.
So the idea of a human achieving godlike status wasn't unique.
Not at all, which leads Essendon to critique the decision made at the Council of Nicaea.
Defining Jesus as fully human and fully God.
Yes. He sees this as a pivotal moment, maybe even, in his words, a spectacular blunder.
Why a blunder?
Because he thinks it led to this awkward concept of Jesus as God in disguise, just pretending to be human. And it also fostered problematic ideas like the ransom theory of atonement.
Where Jesus pays off a debt to Satan.
Right, which doesn't really fit this model of inner transformation and purification. Now, buckle up, because here's where he introduces what he calls the first key to decoding all this.
Okay, I'm ready. The first key is?
The landscape of the sacred stories, especially the New Testament. It represents the human body.
The human body. Wait, what? Like Jerusalem is the heart or something?
Kind of, but much more detailed and specific than that. It's more than just a simple allegory. He points to John 2.21, where Jesus explicitly says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." But he was speaking about the temple of his body.
Huh. I remember that verse.
So according to Essendon's analysis, the cities, the places, the people, the journeys in these narratives, they symbolize the psychosomatic architecture of a human being.
Psychosomatic.
Yeah.
So mind and body.
Yes. Organs, nerve networks, energy centers. and especially key nerve pathways, like the 12 main spinal nerves mapping onto the 12 disciples, perhaps. And apparently, even Eusebius, the guy who compiled the canon, wrote that ancient knowledge of physiology was often deliberately concealed within myths and legends.
That's a completely radical way to read the Bible.
It absolutely is.
Ugh.
But Assendin argues it's consistent with how initiatory religions often work multiple layers of meaning, an outer story for everyone, and an inner esoteric meaning revealed gradually to initiates.
And this ties into early Christian ideas.
Yes, concepts like the sanctification of the body. The idea that through practices like celibacy, prayer, mantra, intense faith, the body itself could become holy, infused with the Holy Spirit.
Leading to those gifts of the Spirit.
Exactly. The healing abilities, the insights, the things that seem extraordinary, they arise from this transformed state of the body-mind.
Okay. So if the Bible is a map of the body, how does that actually work? How does it help understand specific confusing parts?
Right, let's test the map. Take St. Paul's famous account of his journey into the third heaven. Remember that?
Vaguely, yes. Caught up to the third heaven.
Assendin connects this directly to the concept of the Troloka, the three worlds or heavens found in Saivism, the ancient worship of Shiva in India.
Scythism again.
Yeah, it's considered one of the oldest continuous traditions. Shiva himself is associated with these three realms, and his symbol, the trident,
The three-pronged.
can be seen as representing the spine, the central channel, and the tripartite structure of the brain. It's an anatomical symbol in this view.
Okay. And Paul mentions being caught up 14 years before he wrote about it. Does that number mean anything?
Assendin sees 14 as a key esoteric marker.
Why 14?
He links it to 14 major psychosomatic energy centers within the human body, plus 7 higher, more subtle ones above the head.
14 centers, like chakras.
Similar idea, yes, but a specific mapping. He talks about the lower, more primal or hellish centers located below the base of the spine, often in the legs.
Hellish centers in the legs.
Yeah, connected conceptually to things like the 7 deadly sins, our more base instincts. He even gets into the Sanskrit names for these lower centers, like Patala, which means underworld or lost humanity.
Wow.
And he mentions how in some sacred anatomy traditions, there's a symbol, like a black square, on the sole of the left foot, representing the deepest point akin to Tartaros in Greek myth.
So when Jesus washes the disciples' feet.
Ah, yes.
Oh.
In this context, it takes on a whole new layer. It's not just humility. It's about purifying these lower centers, releasing the accumulated negative baggage, the karma, believed to gather in the legs and feet.
That makes a strange kind of sense.
Then you have the human centers, the ones associated with virtues, running from the groin area up to the crown of the head, again with specific Sanskrit names. Sahasrara at the crown, Muladhara at the base.
So these centers represent different levels of consciousness.
Exactly. Different evolutionary stages.
Yeah.
Most people, Assendin suggests, operate primarily from the lower centers, like Muladhara, focused on survival, the material world, ego.
Okay, what about Paul's letters to the 7 churches in Revelation? Those are real places, right? Ephesus, Smyrna.
They were real cities, yes. But Assendin argues they also function, poetically and enigmatically, as a map of the 7 main chakras.
The 7 churches are the 7 chakras.
That's his interpretation. Chakra is Sanskrit for wheel, often translated wheel of power. And interestingly, the Greek word kirk, or kirkos, also means circle, like a circle of power.
A linguistic link.
Potentially. He's done detailed work looking at the presiding deities, the local myths, the characteristics associated with each of those 7 ancient cities.
And found connections.
And found, he argues, compelling correlations to the known attributes and inner wiring, so to speak, of the corresponding chakras. His conclusion is that Paul, or whoever wrote Revelation, was clearly familiar with this chakra system, likely from mystery school traditions.
That's a bold claim. Are there other examples of this kind of map?
He points to Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus visits 7 islands associated with masculine figures or challenges, and 7 associated with feminine ones. 14 again.
14 islands.
And think about those myths of dismemberment. Osiris in Egypt, cut into 14 pieces by Seth.
Right, Isis gathers them.
Or the Saivite myth of the goddess Sati. Her body is dismembered and the parts fall across India, becoming sacred pilgrimage sites, the Shakti Pithas. Again, this pattern, it seems to point to an underlying anatomical or energetic structure.
So Christianity wasn't invented out of thin air.
Assendin strongly argues no. He quotes St. Augustine again, who flat out said that the essence of the Christian religion existed among the ancients long before Christ appeared in the flesh.
That aligns with the Hindu idea of Sanatana Dharma.
Exactly, the eternal doctrine. Occident sees Christianity, in its original esoteric form, as a brilliant synthesis and continuation of existing mystery traditions. Apollo, Dionysus, Osiris, Mithras.
Adapting the ancient wisdom for a new era.
Yes, specifically for the new astrological age, the age of Pisces, hence the fish symbol being so prominent.
Now we're moving into Aquarius.
So he suggests, don't be surprised if religious iconography starts to shift again to reflect Aquarian themes. But the core wisdom, he insists, is ancient. It's Eastern in origin, predating even the Old Testament. And he believes it's key to understanding things like the pyramids of Giza, too.
This framework, this idea of the body as a spiritual landscape,
Yeah,
it really does connect traditions that seem totally separate.
it really does. And Ascendant emphasizes this yogic perspective, not just yoga poses, but the whole philosophical and experiential framework from India and Tibet,
Why India and Tibet specifically?
because he sees them as the places where this ancient science of transformation was preserved most effectively, partly because it wasn't suppressed and persecuted in the same way it arguably was in the West by the Church.
So decoding Western texts requires looking east.
In his view, yes. It requires deep study, intuition, piecing together symbols and clues, because the direct lineage of teachers was broken in the West.
Okay, let's recap the key discoveries from this perspective.
All right, so first, there seems to have been a secret, universal doctrine about spiritual transformation.
Right. Universal.
Second, it involves a model of the human being centered around energy centers, like chakras, maybe 5 main ones in older systems, later refined to 7.
Chakras. Got it.
Third, there are various names for this inner subtle body: the sacred body, light body, temple, church, and different names for the chakras too: planets, seals, islands.
Okay, different terms for the same things?
Fourth, it's initiatory knowledge,
Yeah.
passed down secretly. And fifth, purification, forgiveness, dealing with your stuff is absolutely essential for the process.
And the biggest insight.
For Ascendant, it's the stunning realization that the landscape described in the Bible maps onto the human body. That just shatters the wall between Western and Eastern traditions.
It allows for a different kind of analysis.
Totally. A more analytical, even scientific scrutiny of these texts becomes possible. And this led him to his next investigation: ancient temples and churches.
If the body is a temple, maybe temples are built like bodies.
Precisely. He looked into the work of scholars like Schwaller de Lubitz, who argued that Egyptian temples, Indian temples, even Gothic cathedrals were designed as esoteric books built in stone, encoding this knowledge of the human microcosm.
So architectural details aren't just decorative.
Maybe not. Think about the tall spire on many old European cathedrals. Some see it as a pagan phallic symbol that got awkwardly incorporated.
Yeah, I've heard that.
But Ascendant suggests maybe it's a deliberate continuation of the doctrine, symbolizing the rising energy along the spine, reaching the crown, reinterpreting it within this sacred body framework.
And other temple designs?
He points to studies suggesting the Luxor Temple in Egypt, Solomon's temple described in the Bible, and many Hindu temples are fundamentally based on the proportions and structure of an idealized human form, usually male.
Like the Vitruvian Man idea.
Kind of, yeah. And even details like the ribbed vaults in Gothic cathedrals. One scholar, Peter Finkelstein, argued they intentionally mimic the human spine and rib cage.
Wow. What about things like zodiac signs found in temples, like at Luxor?
Ascendant suggests they weren't just astrological calendars. They might also have functioned as medical symbols, linked to specific regions and functions of the human body. There's an ancient text, Pseudo-Hippocrates, that makes these links.
So the carvings on the walls?
Might actually depict the interplay of subtle energies and forces within those corresponding body regions. It suggests the ancient cults had a deeply tantric or psychosomatic understanding. They knew which body parts were involved in transformation.
Which makes you wonder, do these ancient symbols, like the zodiac, hold biological knowledge we've forgotten?
It's a tantalizing question, isn't it? Think about yogis who can withstand extreme cold or control their heart rate. We clearly don't understand the body's full potential.
How do gods and goddesses fit into this? The Egyptian pantheon, for instance.
Right. Ascendant introduces the Egyptian concept of Neter. He argues these weren't gods in the way we usually think of them, separate beings sitting on clouds.
What were they then?
More like specific configurations of consciousness, archetypal forces or principles that are part of the innate intelligence of the cosmos itself.
That sounds a bit like Buddhist ideas.
Very much so. It resonates strongly with the Buddhist concept of Buddha nature, the inherent potential for enlightenment in all things. And in Mahayana Buddhism, There's this idea that consciousness is primary.
Consciousness comes first.
Yeah, and all sentient beings, all forms, arise from it. So the body isn't just a machine with a ghost pilot. It's a temporary collection, an aggregation of different consciousness configurations. A city of consciousnesses, you might say.
The city.
Think about composite mythological creatures. Griffins, sphinxes. Maybe they represent combinations of different intelligences, different functional types that are invested in humanity as a kind of pinnacle of nature.
Are there parallels elsewhere?
He mentions a Buddhist text, the Toshaka Sutta, where the Buddha organizes human experience into 6 categories of consciousness, each with 6 functions. It's another way of mapping the inner complexity, not identical to the Egyptian leader, but a parallel approach.
And this view of the body as a collection that leads to the Buddhist idea of no fixed self.
Exactly. If you're an ever-changing amalgamation of consciousnesses, where is the permanent, unchanging you? The self becomes an illusion, a process, rather than a static thing.
But that also means change is possible.
Right. It's the basis for growth and transformation. Plato even used an allegory of the soul as a city, the metropolis, with different parts needing to work together. Ascendon also touches on the idea, found in many traditions, of other life forms, nagas, devas, gods existing on parallel planes.
Beings we might sense sometimes.
Perhaps, felt in our bodies or minds. But he suggests they mostly leave us alone because, frankly, we're often ignorant, maybe even violent, and don't perceive them clearly. That's drawing from his own reported experiences, too.
You mentioned this is a tantric way of thinking. Can you unpack that a bit? How does Buddhism fit?
Yeah, tantric here refers to working directly with consciousness and energy. He describes Tibetan Buddhism specifically as a tantric religion.
But isn't Buddhism different from Hinduism?
It is, but he sees its roots in the same soil. He argues Tibetan Buddhism essentially took the core principles of Saivism, the interplay of consciousness, Shiva, and energy, Shakti, but largely discarded the elaborate Vedic mythology and pantheon.
Focusing just on consciousness.
Right, on the nature of mind and reality, seeing all sentient beings as caught in the same fundamental predicament, though they did retain some key Saivite figures like Bhairava and Bhairavi in tantric forms.
Are there still connections today?
He points to things like the Dalai Lama participating in the Kumbh Mela in India. That's a massive festival, bringing together all the diverse yogic lineages, including Saivites. It shows a recognition of shared roots.
What about core Buddhist ideas like no self or emptiness? How does that relate to saying God is the core?
Ascendon suggests they're 2 sides of the same coin. Saying there's no fixed self is, in a way, pointing towards that deeper reality, the divine spark, that which isn't the limited ego. It challenges our usual boundaries of me and not me. Think of verses like, I and the Father are one, or lose yourself to find yourself.
So why did Buddhism drop the mythology, the gods?
He proposes it was a deliberate cultural strategy by the Buddha, seeing how literal interpretations of myths could lead to tribalism, conflict, fanaticism, what's called a dharma, or unrighteousness, especially when the deeper esoteric understanding gets lost.
So Buddha was trying to prevent that.
Perhaps trying to wipe the slate clean, given the social changes and religious corruption happening in India at that time. A fresh start focused on direct experience and ethics. But again, Ascendon stresses the fundamental insights, the Disciplina Arcani about consciousness and transformation, are shared with traditions like the Egyptian one, even if the language and symbols differ. He even quotes a sutta where the Buddha talks about discovering an ancient path trodden by enlightened ones of the past.
Okay, are there other intriguing connections or synchronicities he found?
Yes, quite a few. He finds it fascinating that neurologically, there are 8 major nerve pathways or currents, sometimes called nadis, identified within the human cranium, which apparently become more tangible during experiences like Kundalini awakening.
8 pathways in the head.
And Buddhism, uniquely, has its 8-fold path to liberation. A coincidence? Maybe. But suggestive.
8. Any other 8s?
Well, think about the Pantheon in Rome. Originally a temple to all the gods, dome-shaped, kind of like a symbolic head for the Roman Empire's sacred body.
Right, the Pantheon.
When Christians took it over, they replaced the statues of the gods, traditionally said to be 8 main ones, with Christian saints, basically refactoring the old myths. And architecturally, it has 8 major niches or pedestals around the circumference, plus 7 chapels, 8 again.
Interesting.
And then there's a Hindu myth where Shiva gives a sage, Gautama, 8 powerful lingams, symbols of divine energy called Mahajyotirlingams. And this happens at the foot of Mount Kailash.
Which is associated with the head in yogic anatomy.
Exactly. So you have this Hindu story, likely pre-Buddhist, linking 8 specific powers to the head region. Again, the details don't match perfectly across traditions, but the recurrence of 8 connected to the head or higher consciousness is striking.
It points towards some shared ancient understanding.
That's the idea, a perennial wisdom that predates the individual religions we know.
Let's circle back to Egypt. You mentioned the nativity scene having precursors there.
Right. Essendon, who happens to be a Virgo, was looking at the section corresponding to Virgo in the Luxor Temple's zodiac layout. This area, anatomically, is linked to the mother goddess principle, the womb area, slightly above the solar plexus.
Okay.
And there he found this mural. It depicts the god Amun appearing to Queen Mutamia, who is called Meriti Amen, informing her she will give birth to a divine child.
Amun and Mary sounds familiar.
Very similar to the Annunciation story with Gabriel and Mary. He sees it as a clear parallel, likely a direct influence or precursor.
Which raises the whole issue of influence and borrowing between religions.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And he notes the strong resistance, particularly within the Abrahamic faiths, to acknowledging this interconnectedness, this idea of a shared esoteric core.
The tendency towards exclusivity.
Yeah, the view that our revelation is the only true one, that God only spoke to us. He links this kind of tribalism directly to centuries of conflict and suffering. He also brings up the parallels between Jesus and Krishna,
Krishna, how so?
striking similarities in their birth narratives. A tyrannical king trying to kill the infant Herod for Jesus, Kamsa for Krishna, the massacre of innocents, being hidden away in exile.
And the criticism that Krishna's mother couldn't have been a virgin.
Essendon tackles that literalist critique. He points out that in this story, Devaki had 7 previous sons who died. He interprets these 7 sons, again symbolically, as the 7 chakras that need to be purified or transcended before the divine birth Krishna can occur. Balarama, the 8th, representing the crown chakra, Sahasrara.
Always circles back to the chakras.
It seems to be the underlying code, and both Krishna and Balarama have all these fantastic adventures defeating demons, much like the trials of Hercules.
Hercules, again, you mentioned him earlier. Christians usually deny any link there, right?
Strongly deny it, yes. Which makes it all the more peculiar, Essendon notes, that the actual chair of St. Peter in Rome,
The Pope's throne?
well, a very ancient symbolic one. It's decorated with carvings depicting the labors of Hercules.
Get out! Hercules' trials on St. Peter's chair.
Apparently so. A rather strange choice if there's supposed to be zero connection between Christ and Hercules, wouldn't you say?
That's bizarre. Where does he go from there?
This leads him to look at the mysteries surrounding another ancient figure often demonized in the Bible, Baal.
Baal, the Canaanite deity.
Yeah. He circles back to Augustine, saying the true religion existed before Christ, and then quotes another church father, Irenaeus.
What did Irenaeus say?
Irenaeus apparently stated quite plainly that Christ was typified and acknowledged as Baal in ancient times, and that the religion Paul was preaching was, in essence, the Baal religion.
Paul was preaching the Baal religion.
That's what Irenaeus seems to imply, according to Aston's reading. Paul, whose 7 churches map to the chakras. Irenaeus even apparently said that Balaam, the prophet in the Old Testament who got Israel involved with Baal worship,
Yeah, the guy with the talking donkey.
that Balaam was actually right in his understanding, but the Jewish priesthood just didn't believe him or accept it.
So these early church fathers saw continuity, not just conflict.
It certainly seems they operated with a different framework,
Mm-hmm.
using archetypes, seeing deeper connections. Essendon is clear. He's not saying they created a deity that's beyond the scope here, but they were clearly versed in the ancient mysteries.
But Baal worship was suppressed, temples destroyed.
Exactly, so the evidence is fragmented. But Essendon points to surviving pieces, symbolic things, architectural bits,
Like what?
like a temple roof in Syria, dedicated to a local Baal that has a Saivite-style roof chakra design with 8 divisions, just like the Pantheon's oculus.
Did it again?
An incense burner found at Hazor in Israel, dating from the Baal period, marked with a cross like a sun cross or Coptic cross. Depictions of a woman, maybe Venus, holding a child, representing the birth of Baal, the sacred seed. Imagery of grapes and vines, usually seen as purely Christian,
Grapes and vines were Baal symbols too.
apparently common. And even actual stone carvings that strongly resemble diagrams of the Muladhara and Svasthana chakras found at the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, which was originally a massive Baal temple complex.
Chakras carved in stone at Baalbek.
That's his interpretation. He also notes the symbol of Baal itself was often a cross variant, which leads him to speculate maybe the negative portrayal of Baal followers in the New Testament was partly payback for the earlier suppression of Baal worship in Israel.
Wow, that's controversial.
Highly. But his main point is whether the church fathers were drawing from Greek, Egyptian, Roman, or Canaanite traditions. It all seems to point back to the same underlying knowledge of the chakras, the inner wiring, the transformative potential. The mythologies are like different masks worn by the same underlying powers, adapted for different cultures.
Okay, this brings us to a really core theological issue. Salvation. How does this esoteric view change the understanding of salvation?
Yeah, it's a huge topic. And Aston highlights the inconsistencies you find in standard theology. Like, what are we actually being saved from? And what's our role in it? Can we influence it?
Good questions.
He contrasts what he sees as the original early Christian understanding with much of modern Christianity, particularly regarding individual effort versus just divine grace.
Modern Christianity often simplifies it, maybe.
He argues it often gives overly simplistic answers, sometimes relying on a scientific view that only accepts material reality, which misses the point of spiritual transformation. He also questions the idea of salvation being immutable, like a done deal.
You mean once saved, always saved?
Right. He points out the historical disconnect between professed beliefs and the actual actions of believers, and even the church itself. How does that square with guaranteed salvation?
So how did early Christians see it differently? Protestantism emphasizes Christ taking all our sins upon himself.
Yes, but Ascendant argues the early view, especially in the East, and among figures like the Desert Fathers, was more about being Christed as a tangible process.
A process involving that seed you mentioned.
Exactly. Baptism and initiation weren't just symbolic. They were seen as the actual planting or awakening of a tangible seed of divine potential within the body.
The mustard seed metaphor.
Precisely. Often located conceptually above the solar plexus, near the left rib cage in the house of Virgo, anatomically speaking.
And this seed, it grows.
It's understood to undertake a journey, moving through the chakras, activating them, purifying them. This isn't comfortable. It causes inner friction, upheaval, especially felt physically around the liver area, he notes.
Why the
Often associated with stored emotions, anger, impurities in traditional systems. But the process leads to a profound transformation of personality, mind, perception, beyond what you could achieve through willpower alone.
Is this related to the dark night of the soul?
Very much so. That period of intense struggle, confusion, ego dissolution. That's seen as part of this transformation as the seed does its work, shifting your focus from outward validation to inner reality.
And this seed is spiritual, not physical.
It's spiritual, energetic, not something you can dissect or measure with current tools. That's why feeling or perceiving one's own spiritual body is key. Without that direct experience, it remains just a myth, a nice idea.
So the seed is the agent of purification.
Yes, it's the purifying force, anciently venerated under symbols like the sacred bull, strong, transformative energy. The process isn't automatic. You can hinder it, disrupt it through your choices and actions.
Which raises the question, how are people in the West supposed to navigate this intense inner process today, mostly without access to genuine teachers or lineage holders?
That's a crucial question he raises. He speaks from personal experience too, mentioning his quite unexpected and unplanned Kundalini awakening happened after he received adult baptism, suggesting the rites might still hold latent power, even if the full understanding is often missing.
It sounds like a potentially perilous journey without a guide.
It can be. And Ascendant reflects on how this underlying esoteric doctrine seems to be fading further as we get more distant from the ancient world.
Literal interpretations are eroding it.
He fears so. Literalism takes over, and even academics often study these cultures in isolation, focusing on differences rather than connecting the dots, missing the bigger picture.
Using something important.
He believes we're losing something vital, something many people instinctively feel is missing, a genuine technology of the soul, he calls it.
Well,
A practical method for communing with the sacred, for experiencing the divine directly, not just believing in it.
in his view of the historical church.
He's quite scathing about the actions of popes, inquisitors, the suppression of knowledge and alternative views. He finds it impossible to reconcile with the organization historically.
What factors led to this loss of knowledge?
He lists quite a few. The deliberate destruction of pagan shrines, temples, and literature. The way Christianization fragmented and repurposed older knowledge, often obscuring its original meaning. Active persecution of pagan teachers and alternative Christian groups. Simple loss through wars, disasters. The rise of modern chemistry and medicine displacing older models of the body. the whole shift in worldview with the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution.
The perfect storm, really.
And ironically, he argues, the church's insistence on the absolute historical accuracy of the Gospels eventually worked against it.
How so?
Because, as historical and textual criticism advanced, inconsistencies and contradictions in the literal narrative became harder to ignore, leading many to doubt the whole thing.
Whereas if the esoteric core had been preserved.
He believes the faith would have been far more resilient, adaptable, and could have actually advanced societal development in profound ways, integrating spiritual wisdom with scientific progress.
But now the church is kind of stuck.
He sees it as deeply entrenched in its literal interpretations, making it incredibly difficult to embrace the esoteric richness within its own foundational texts, let alone integrate insights from other traditions or even modern science about consciousness.
This has been an absolutely fascinating deep dive, really exploring John Leonard Asenden's work and perspective.
He's mind-bending stuff.
The connections you've drawn out between ancient mystery traditions, early Christianity, this universal map of the human body, it's truly remarkable. Challenges a lot of assumptions.
It really does. And that idea of a lost technology of the soul, it's powerful, isn't it? It certainly makes you think differently about religion, spirituality, and our own potential for transformation.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. If there's compelling evidence, as Ossenden presents, for this kind of hidden universal doctrine connecting seemingly disparate religions through the human body, what other fields of knowledge, seemingly separate today, might actually be interconnected in ways we haven't realized? And maybe more personally, what does this potential loss of ancient esoteric understanding mean for us right now, as individuals seeking meaning, connection, and maybe even transformation in the modern world?
Heavy questions, but important ones.
Absolutely. Lots to think about. We definitely encourage you to delve deeper into these topics, maybe check out some of the sources and ideas we touched on today.